is Distinguished University Professor at University of Maryland, and he's published a lot. Actually, this is his whole Vita, and it's double-sided. If it was single, 35 pages, trying to be environmentally friendly, it's a lot that George has done over his very notable career. He's published 13 monographs, notably including The Globalization of Nothing, Enchanting a Disenchanted World, which is subtitled Revolutionizing the Means of Consumption, and The McDonaldization of Society. His books have been translated into over 20 languages. It's quite interesting just reading the translation languages, everything from Turkish to Hungarian to Arabic. So he's got a real worldwide audience that's reading his material. Professor Ritzer holds a PhD from Cornell and has been a visiting professor at universities of Bremen, Tampere, Surrey, and Peking, as well as holding appointments at University of Kansas and Tulane University. His work has been cited extensively. A book which I've used in classes here at Bowdoin, some of you have read either with me or other professors, The McDonaldization of Society, has nearly 5,000 citations in Google Scholar, which is no mean feat. If I could do that with one of my books, I would be very, very happy. His work has been the subject of numerous edited collections, television interviews, radio segments, and newspaper articles around the world. The Wall Street Journal, Guardian, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and New York Post have all covered his work over the years. And Professor Ritzer has also published, as I had mentioned with his Vita, scores of journal articles, and has been featured in numerous television appearances and radio interviews. So it's a real pleasure to be able to have Professor Ritzer here at Bowdoin to be speaking with us and to be sharing his talk, which is titled Prosumption, Evolution, Revolution, or Eternal Return of the Same. I'd like to introduce Professor Ritzer.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? You're all sitting in the back where I usually like to sit. That's my I'd like to speak from back there, actually. Okay, so the title is Prosumption, Evolution, Revolution, or Eternal Return of the Same. And that's the way. So I want to start by saying that, we've all been wrong about the way in which we think about ourselves. I think historically, we have tended to think of ourselves as either producers or workers, that is, people who produce various things, usually on the job, or we think of ourselves as consumers, that is, basically consuming that which producers produce. And so we've historically and contemporaneously separate the producer from the consumer. And what I'd like to argue is that's wrong. That's a historical error. And there is no such thing as a pure production or consumption. Part of it is a product of intellectual history in the sense that there was an era basically from 1850 to 1950, which I've labeled as productivism, where a number of major social thinkers writing in the wake of the Industrial Revolution tended to focus on issues that related to production. And so there's Marx, of course, and Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, even Thorstein Veblen. I say even Thorstein Veblen because Thorstein Veblen is best known for his work on consumption and for his theory of what he called conspicuous consumption. But interestingly, the overwhelming focus of Veblen's work was on production. And so in Marx, this productivism is manifest in Marx's famous labor theory of value, that for Marx the value of anything is traceable to the labor that went into it. Weber, in terms of his productivism, focused on those things which encouraged the development of a rationalized economy and the barriers to the rise of a rationalized economy, again, mainly from a production point of view. Emil Durkheim focused on the division of labor within the production sector and argued that the solution to the problems of the world of his day was the creation of occupational associations. So the solution to various problems lay in the realm of production or in work. Veblen, as I said, even though he's known for his focus on conspicuous consumption was very concerned with what he called the instinct for workmanship, obviously a production orientation. And the bulk of his work is about the conflict between what he called business and industry. Industry from his point of view is concerned with maximizing production, with being as efficient as they possibly can. And here he was thinking mainly of the workers as being industry or industrious. And he saw them as being opposed by business people who wanted to restrict industry, who wanted to restrict their effectiveness and efficiency, because if workers were too efficient and too effective, prices would be too low and profits would be too low. So again, his focus here is on a conflict that exists within the realm of production. In terms of, there is in the work of these people, even though they focused on production, a concern with issues of consumption. In Marx, for example, he was interested in the issue of productive consumption, that is consumption that produced various kinds of things. Use value is a concept that relates to that things are useful because they can be consumed. And so there is, even though these theorists focused on production, there is in their work a concern with consumption, but it's secondary to their concern and interest in production. On the other hand, after 1950, and of course in the United States after World War II, we saw a boom in the consumption economy, and a number of important social theorists shifted their attention from production to consumption. And so we had from 1950 to 2007, I'm not sure why I picked 2007. Oh, I know I picked 2007, because that's the onset of the Great Recession that we continue to experience some of the effects of. And but during that period, a number of important thinkers, John Kenneth Galbraith, Jean Baudrillard, Zygmunt Bauman, all began to focus on consumption. So a shift from a focus on production to a focus on consumption. Again, this binary distinction being created here. In 2000, there was the creation of the Journal of Consumer Culture, which was the first important kind of social science journal devoted to consumption, which I was a founding editor of and edited for about 7 years. And there's also postmodernity, the move toward postmodern social theory. And one of the main things that was associated with the postmodern era was consumption. That is, the modern era was considered to be the era of production, the postmodern era considered to be the era of consumption. What I want to argue is that bifurcation, that those two foci are erroneous, were erroneous, continue to be erroneous, that the primal act for humans is not production or consumption, but it is a prosumption. That is, from the beginning, humans were prosumers. That is, they produced what they consumed what they produced. They were, as I define in the next line there, which is the definition I'm using here for prosumption, the interrelated process of production and consumption. So from the beginning, people were prosumers, people are today prosumers, and they will in the future be prosumers. And so I'm on a mission to get us to move away from this erroneous conception of ourselves as producers or workers on the one hand, or as consumers on the other, and to see us always as being prosumers. So I want to argue, and we can talk about this in the question and answer period if you want, I want to argue that all production involves consumption. That is, anytime we are involved in any kind of productive activity, we are consuming something. And actually, Marx argues this point in Capital, and that is that people who are producing things are consuming raw materials, they are consuming energy, they are consuming their own labor power, and so in that sense, production involves consumption. Consuming the tools that they use, the machines that they use. And conversely, all consumption involves production. That is, there is work involved in consumption. I first got into this, although I wasn't calling it presumption, in the first edition of the McDonaldization Society, which goes back to 1993, where I wrote a section on putting the customers to work. And for me, one of the defining characteristics of McDonaldized settings is that as customers, we are required to do various work. And it first offended me. I remember the first time I went to a McDonald's with my children, and we ate, and then I got up to leave, and they stopped me as if I had committed a terrible crime to tell me that I had to clean up after myself. And this was a shock. And so there are many aspects of the fast food restaurant which clearly involve this. You think you're consuming, but actually, of course, you're engaged in a variety of acts of production. To me, the major contemporary example is the drive-through window, where you are doing various kinds of work, most notably working as garbage men or women for McDonald's. So you are performing the service of not leaving them the garbage so that workers have to clean up, but you're taking the garbage with you, and then it becomes your job to dispose of that garbage. So I want to argue, and we can discuss this, that all production involves consumption, all consumption involves production, or it's all about prosumption. So what I want to try to do is to get you to think in these terms, that we're talking about a continuum here. It's all a presumption continuum. And the one end I want to talk about, and it's a little bit awkward, but prosumption as production. So that there is the kind of production that Marx was talking about, workers producing things, but in producing things, they are consuming things. So that's the presumption as production end of the continuum. And the other end of the continuum is presumption as consumption, the McDonald's examples that I just gave you. And in the middle is something called balanced presumption, where the productive aspects and the consumption aspects are more or less balanced. So the point is, there's no production here, there's no consumption here, it's all presumption of one kind or another. So as I said, this concept of presumption is implicit in much of classical sociology. I mentioned the example of Marx and the way in which he's implicitly talking about presumption in the production process. But the concept is most explicit and coined, as far as I know, for the first time in Alvin Toffler's famous book of the day, Future Shock. Now that was a very well-known popular book. Toffler was known as a futurist, a popularist, and it was widely read in its day. But it was not taken seriously as a scholarly work. And so the result is that the concept of presumption was largely ignored in the social sciences until early 2000s. Now, Toffler had a number of interesting things to say, and also said, I think, a number of erroneous things about the prosumer. He talked about what he called the most recent development, or the third wave, and he associated with the third wave the renaissance of the prosumer, and he recognized that that presumption is the primal act, making the same point that I'm making here. He had a very romantic view of the prosumer. He argued that those who are prosumers have less monotonous lifestyles. That is, you're basically doing things for yourself, and you can vary things as a prosumer. So you have a more varied, a more well-rounded life. You're more creative, and ultimately, being a prosumer is more satisfying. And in a quote, he says, quote, "Prosumers are the unsung heroes of the economy to come." So he's looking to the future. He's a futurist, and he's saying that the heroes of that time to come are the prosumers. He talks about new forms of religion, art, social and political institutions, scientific advances, all being associated with the rise of the prosumer, or the expansion of the prosumer. There are a number of failures, however, in Toffler's work. He fails to anticipate the co-optation that takes place in prosumption, the degree to which owners and business people co-opt the prosumer. So from my point of view, when you go to McDonald's and you're using the drive-through, or you're cleaning up after yourself, you are being co-opted by McDonald's to their profit. And he didn't see he didn't take that kind of critical view of the process of of presumption. He also seemed to think that we were prosumers sometimes and not prosumers at other times. I think we're prosumers all the time. You're prosuming here in the sense that you are consuming, I hope, what I'm saying, but you're also producing thoughts. Maybe I see a few of you writing notes, but you are producing as you're consuming this talk. So we're not prosumers at one time or another, we're always prosumers. He talks about a prosumption sector within society. I would argue there is no such thing as a prosumption sector. All sectors are involved in this process of prosumption. Education is characterized by prosumption, medical sector increasingly characterized by prosumption, et cetera. People do not, again, contradicting Toffler's point, people do not move in and out of the presumption sector. They're always in the presumption sector, et cetera. So while he anticipated a lot of key arguments about the prosumer, he had an overly romantic view of the prosumer, and he had some erroneous conceptions of the prosumer. Yet, I think it's to his great credit that he divined this idea when he did. Now, what's happened since 2000 is the emergence of a series of similar ideas, and they are DIY, do-it-yourself. Now, of course, that idea is not just an academic idea. That's a popular idea as well. You all talk about DIY, I think, in one way or another. But academics, mainly after 2000, began to write about do-it-yourself kinds of activities. And do-it-yourself has a strong element of presumption, or is defined by presumption. A work in 2004 by Ledbetter and Miller on the pro-am, which basically argues that we're seeing a convergence of the professional and the amateur, so that the amateur is increasingly doing professional kind of work. Again, an elimination of that kind of binary. Service-dominant logic in 2004 is, again, a similar idea. The notion here being that it's no longer enough to sell people products, but you have to service people constantly, and you have to engage in an ongoing production consumption relationship with those people who buy your products. Co-creation is a business perspective here, and the idea is that business people have to recognize that their customers are in the business of, or in the process of co-creating what businesses are selling to them. And what the business people want to do here is they want to get business people to use these ideas in order to maximize the degree to which you use consumers in various ways to maximize your profitability. Craft consumption is a sociological idea, and basically it's the idea that there are people who are craft consumers. Craft consumers are people who may buy various kinds of components, or may find various kinds of components, let's say old bicycles, for example, or buy several bicycles, and then put them together in unique kinds of ways. So they're both consumers and producers. In media studies, the idea of the producer, Avery Brunn's notion, created in 2005, is the best known of these kinds of concepts. And in media studies, and also this is true of the convergence culture idea and the Birmingham School idea, in media studies, they're long attuned to this notion that the audience co-creates the performance. So you are co-creating this, we are co-creating this performance, and that'll be clearer when we have some participation after this it goes on. But we're always co-creating this, and so this concern for the active audience, that audiences are never passive. Audiences are never simply consumers. You are not, or you should not be, passive as an audience. You should be active here and saying, no, he's wrong about that. How could he say that? And presumably when we get to the Q&A, you'll have some examples. Now, what are the examples of presumption? The first one is one that was just sent to me in the last few days, is a proposal by Walmart. Walmart is thinking about having its customers in the store deliver products that were ordered online. So Walmart wants to put its customers to work, delivering its products. Now, I've said to several people that I don't see as coming into fruition because there are huge risks involved here. You give somebody a product, and off they go and disappear with the product would be one of the minimal risks. The maximal risk is you're giving it to killers who are going to people's houses and gaining access because they're delivering Walmart products and killing their customers. I have kind of a perverted view of the world, but at least it's possible. So I've already talked about working in fast food restaurants. You all work in fast food restaurants all the time. I just worked at your cafeteria at lunchtime. I had to find my tray. I couldn't find my tray. I needed help to the plates. I had to clean up after myself. I mean, it was an endless amount of work. I mean, if this talk is not as good as it should be, it's because I've been exhausted by all the presumption that I had to do. Supermarkets are all about presumption. You know, when I was a kid, 1888, 1889, I used to go to the local grocer in New York, and my mother would pin a list to my sleeve, and I'd go to the grocery, take the list off me, go wandering around the grocery store, getting everything I wanted. He put it in a bag, and he did all the work. I just stood there and waited for the you know, now we, you know, work endlessly in supermarkets. IKEA, of course, is all about putting the consumer to work. Well, we're just wandering around that place is work. But of course, you have to take home all of those packages and construct your own bookcase. And so we all work for IKEA in that way as well. ATM machines, you're doing the work of bank tellers. We now have do-it-yourself dog washing shops where you bring your dog into this shop and you wash your own dog. Do-it-yourself yogurt making shops. My wife loves this yogurt making place where you go in and you can make your own yogurt. I don't get it, but we got electronic check-in at airports. There used to be people who checked. I know you don't remember this, but there used to be people there who did that work. You do that work. Now you check in. Same thing with hotels. Home medical testing. There used to be doctors who tested you for various kinds of problems. Now, increasingly, we test ourselves. So those are all kind of material examples. Digital examples, almost everything online is presumption. I don't have it here, but Twitter is an example of where you're simultaneously producing and consuming in an endless kind of fashion. The same is true on Facebook. I mean, one of the great ironies about Facebook is what the company's worth $100 billion today. Zuckerberg is worth a good portion of that. And why is he worth that? He's worth that because of you. He's worth that because of all the information that you have provided for him and are constantly providing him. And so it's on your backs that Facebook has become a $100 billion company, and the same is true of many other things. So YouTube, you download the videos and watch other people's videos. Wikipedia, we are all consumers of Wikipedia. We read the entries. We are constantly modifying the entries. Blogging, of course, is all about presumption, right? Those who produce the blogs read other people's blogs. Working for Amazon.com in terms of doing the ordering of books, writing reviews for nothing for Amazon.com, all about presumption. eBay is similar kind of a situation. We make our own travel arrangements on Expedia, peer-to-peer lending on Zopa, lodging on Airbnb, couches on couchsurfing, all examples, it seems to me, of presumption. And this emergence of MOOCs, of massive open online courses. To a large degree, the students are going to do the work. And one of the things the students are going to do is they're going to grade themselves. If you've got 130,000 students in the world, as one of these courses does, nobody's going to be sitting and grading 130,000 essay exams. And so one of the ways in which it works is that the students will be enlisted as the graders, and we'll do other kinds of work as well. I'm making a distinction here between the digital and material world, but they are not clearly distinct worlds. They interpenetrate in various kinds of ways, and as my student Nathan Jurgensen in the back there has written about, calling them, talking about augmented reality, that the digital and the material augment one another rather than thinking of them as separable. I've probably killed that idea, but Nathan can clarify it for in the discussion. So the question then, that's all background to the question of the central issue here of the emergence or the reemergence. From my point of view, of course, it wouldn't be emergence because we've always been prosumers. So it's the reemergence of the prosumer and presumption in the contemporary world. In terms of all the material and digital examples I gave you, they're all very contemporary examples, right? So the question is, are we talking about revolutionary developments here? Are we talking about evolutionary developments, that these have evolved out of similar circumstances in the not too distant past? Or are we talking about what Nietzsche and Walter Benjamin referred to as the eternal return of the same? That is, we've always done it, we did it from the beginning, and we're simply doing it again. So those are the three hypotheses here that I want to look at. The first one is the revolutionary development hypothesis. This is a revolutionary development. This set of things that I'm talking about in terms of contemporary developments in prosumption are revolutionary. They're revolutionary, why? Well, we're doing things we never did before. Washing our dogs in dog washing salons, or making our own yogurt in yogurt shops, or serving as tellers on ATM machines. So many of the things that I talked about before, we never did before. And so that constitutes a revolutionary kind of development. Secondly, it could be argued, I would argue, although I have no data to prove this, but then I'm a theorist, so I never need data. I can just assert things and say that they're theory. The theory is, however, that prosumption is a new cause of unemployment. That is that if we try to understand our current high unemployment rate of something like 7.5%, I would argue, or it's arguable, that one of the reasons our unemployment rate is as high as it is that we as prosumers are doing a lot of the tasks that people used to get paid for. So there are fewer bank cashiers because we're working in ATM machines. And that list could be made extremely long in the sense of the jobs that have been replaced because the consumers are doing those jobs. I need to do more with that, but I think there's a lot of merit in that argument. Relatedly, or not unrelatedly, companies are making unprecedented profits. We see, the stock market is at a new all-time high. Companies are making unprecedented profits. And, I would suggest that one of the reasons they're making unprecedented profits is that they have a whole new group of people to exploit. And I'll come back to this issue of exploitation. But basically, if you look historically, corporations were profitable from a critical Marxian perspective because they exploited workers. They paid workers very little. Now they have something brand new. They pay prosumers nothing, and we do the work for them. And so the ability to earn profits is obviously that much greater when you pay people nothing as opposed to even a small amount. We live in an era of free products and free labor. Much of the internet revolves around the free products that we can get there and the free labor that we do there. New technologies related to prosumption, and a really dramatic one, I think, is the coming of 3D printers. They already exist. They're being refined. The 3D printer allows us as consumers to produce, theoretically, anything. Theoretically, we will be able in our homes to produce an automobile with one of these printers. And now, of course, what we can produce with these 3D printers is comparatively minor, but in the not too distant future, we're going to be able to produce some major kinds of things with 3D printers. And 3D printers, I think, makes clear the fact that the distinction between the producer and the consumer makes no sense. And what we see also in terms of revolutionary developments are new material and digital, what I call means of prosumption. The concept of the means of prosumption is based in part on Marx's concept of the means of production. Marx's argument was that in order to be productive, people need means, so you need tools, or you need machines, or you need factories to be productive. That's the means of production. And for Marx, of course, the capitalist owned the means of production. Workers had to sell their labor time in order to have access to the means of production. A few years ago, I discovered that Marx had used the concept of the means of consumption, but he had used it, I think, erroneously. I'm arrogant enough to try to correct Karl Marx. But the means of consumption for me are parallel to the means of production. That is, it's what you need in order to consume. And so we need supermarkets, so we need fast food restaurants, so we need drive-through windows, we need ATM machines. Those are all the means of consumption. So what I would argue then is that in the contemporary world, the revolutionary development now is in the means of prosumption. And so we're talking about means of production, means of consumption, means of prosumption. Now, if you want to argue that the development is not revolutionary, but rather is evolutionary, I just listed several examples here of where there is an evolution taking place. So we can go back to food stalls and cafeterias and fast food restaurants evolving out of them. Amazon.com evolving out of the Sears catalog and shopping malls. eBay evolving from auctions. Self-help as being something that always existed. Self-medical diagnosis is the same thing, and DIY and craft consumption is the same. So these things have long been there, and the most recent iterations of them have evolved out of those in the recent past. The most interesting argument, perhaps, is the eternal return of the same argument, as I mentioned, from Nietzsche and Walter Benjamin. And here, basically, it's accepting the idea that the prosumption and the prosumers were torn apart by the Industrial Revolution, that before that, there was more of a more clear unity between producers and consumers, or it was more clearly prosumers, but the Industrial Revolution tore that apart. And so that this process of prosumption has recurred throughout history, and it continues to occur to this day. The eternal return of the same view of this, that we keep, it's sort of like Groundhog Day, you know, the movie Groundhog Day, we keep waking up and it's the same thing, so that's the point that's being made here. If you adopt the eternal return of the same perspective, you're critical of progress, and therefore critical of the other two ideas here, that prosumption is a revolutionary development or an evolutionary development. There's a kind of dialectical process here that is pushing forward this eternal return of the same. And, you know, kind of classic examples of the eternal return of the same are weather and fashion, that weather is an eternal return of the same. It's always been there, and fashion, a similar kind of argument is made. And then if you look historically, the movement from bazaars to souks, from arcades to malls, from malls to Amazon, these are all pretty much the same kind of phenomenon recurring over and over again. But the argument is made by Walter Benjamin that when the primal scene returns in the contemporary world, it returns in ultra-modern Getup. So while it's a return of the internal return of the same, there's a kind of new Getup, and that Getup is the internet, which is something new, and 3D printers. But even though we're talking about eternal return of the same here, the point is that there are differences between the same as it exists today and the same as it existed in the past. So which is it? And to cut to the chase, it's all three. I mean, I think all three of those things are defensible. They are all true to one extent or another, and I don't think we have to choose between them. What can we talk about see in terms of the future? I think we've always been prosumers. I think there's no question in the future prosumption is going to be increasingly important. I think it's going to take radically, perhaps unforeseen at this point, forms in the future. I think there's no return to focusing on production and consumption. I think we simply have to move beyond thinking in those terms, and that's a radical shift since we've always thought in those terms. Or at least we can't think of them outside of the prosumption context. And I think we're going to see more balanced prosumption, more toward the middle of the continuum. And this is going to be true in the material world, but it's especially going to be true in the digital world, which is the site par excellence, I think, for this process of prosumption. So one of the questions is prosumption a force for positive social change? I said at the beginning that Toffler had a very romantic view of the prosumer. And so he saw the prosumer as definitely a force for positive social change. I think it is at least potentially the case that the prosumer has more agency, is more of an active agent than either the producer or the consumer. And the prosumer has more power. I mean, the whole notion of a prosumer is giving you an enormous amount of power. You're not simply consuming this talk, you are prosuming this talk, which means you are actively interpreting it. You are producing it in various ways. So you have much more power than you would if we thought of you as simply consumers of this talk or as a passive audience. But I think that the potential of the prosumer and the potential for you to think of yourself as prosumers is more of a consciousness of the fact that you're prosumers, more perhaps in Marxian terminology as a class for itself, that is a class that understands that there is something distinctive about it that you have in common and that you can use as a base to attain power. And a similar idea I like from the sociologist Irving Goffman is the notion of dangerous giants. I always think of my students in my classes as dangerous giants. I think of all of you as dangerous giants because who knows what you're going to say when I open up this for a question and answer period, or what you would do during the lecture. I mean, most of the time people don't do very much, but you have the potential to do radical kinds of things. I once had a student maybe 20 years ago who, from the beginning of the class, got up and wandered around the class. He'd move from one seat to another. Eventually, he'd start to climb up on the desks and jump from one desk to another. And he behaved in such a way that he eventually destroyed the class. But he was a dangerous giant in a psychotic kind of way. You all, I don't think many of you are psychotic, but I don't know you very well. Maine winters may drive many of you to psychoses, but you still retain the ability to say all kinds of things that could show me up for a charlatan, or poke such devastating holes in my argument that this whole performance is destroyed. But the point again is that as a dangerous giant, you are a prosumer and you have power. Unless there is this kind of realization that you're prosumers, that you're a class for itself, that you're dangerous giants, the prosumer will be co-opted by those in power. The prosumer has been co-opted by those in power, and the likelihood is that the prosumer will continue to be co-opted by those in power, mainly because there are great profits to be made by co-opting you as prosumers. Or even if it's not a profit motive, it's a power motive. If I can convince you that you're not dangerous giants, that you're simply a passive audience, that you're not prosumers of this, you're much less likely to question me, and therefore I have much more power. Much of being professorial is to convince the students that you have all of the answers and to silence all questions. The prosumer leads us to re-examine some age-old ideas in the social sciences. Another one of my students, P.J. Ray, who's come in, but I don't know where he went. Oh, there you are. Has been writing about alienation of the prosumer. And he makes the point that one of the characteristics of alienation is a kind of structural separation. For Marx, alienation is defined by separation. For example, separation between people and their products, or separation between people and other people. You could argue that the prosumer is similarly structurally separated, But what is strange from a Marxian point of view is that the prosumer seems very content with this. None of you are very unhappy about going to the ATM machine or going to the cafeteria. I mean, start a rebellion in the cafeteria. No more prosumption in the cafeteria. It's movement. This is like Arlo Guthrie at Alice's Restaurant, right? But there's very little protest. You know, more and more stuff is put on you to do, and you do it. And you're content with it. In fact, some people prefer it. Like, what drives me crazy is the self-checkout line in a supermarket. Why should I have to check out my own? There are people to do this work. Sometimes when I arrive late at a supermarket and there's nobody at the human checkout lanes, I'll just stand there and wait for somebody to come, because I am not going through the self-checkout. It makes me mad. Actually, almost everything I write about is something that makes me mad. It's much cheaper than psychotherapy. Actually, I get paid to do this. Instead of paying a psychotherapist, I get this. There is re-examining the age-old idea of exploitation. And this is the point I made earlier. Prosumers get less than low pay that the factory worker used to get. You get no pay. I mean, what level of exploitation are we talking about when you're working for nothing? And that's what you're doing. You're working for nothing. And then the question is, should we be returning to these old ideas like alienation and exploitation, or do we need new ideas in terms of thinking about the prosumer? So the concluding line is, sociologists and academicians in general don't like futurism. Futurism is speculation, and there are no data to support speculation, and so we ought to be avoiding that. And I simply want to make the point and the case that Alvin Toffler was a futurist. He had no data for the arguments that he was making, but he wrote in 1980 about a change that people ignored for 20, 25 years, and I think has come to fruition, perhaps even beyond what he could have ever imagined. And I think rather than rejecting futurism, perhaps we need more futurism in the social sciences. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions and answers, so if you raise your hand, we'll bring over a microphone to you.
So I've tried to goad you into activism here, so.
You all have to become prosumers now.
But no jumping over your chairs.
You get a gym workout then.
Huh?
You get a gym workout.
Yeah, right.
This concept of prosumerism makes me want to coin another concept, perhaps citizen government. In a sense, the notion of government in a democracy involves citizens as active participants.
Right.
And in a sense, this works in the opposite direction. There's the bifurcation historically of consumer and producer, and you're bringing them together. We live in an era where citizen and government have been increasingly bifurcated. And in a sense, citizen engagement in government is a good thing.
Okay.
You're arguing, in a sense, almost the opposite for consumer production. That is, that consumers are exploited by those who profit from production. And I'm trying to put these ideas together as social change occurs.
Right.
Because I think that changes in perception of government are pretty powerful and important ones.
Right. I mean, I agree with you. What I was trying to argue is that the problem is not in prosumption. The problem is in the way in which corporations and other entities exploit prosumption to their own benefit. I mean, I tried to make the point that the presumer has a lot of power theoretically and agency, and can make a difference, can be dangerous giants. So, I think it's not, the problem is not in the idea, the problem is in the fact, that's why I'm sort of making this semi-revolutionary kind of argument, that the problem is not in the idea, but the way it's being implemented by those who profit from it from an economic point of view and a power point of view. There are those who have applied the concept to the government, and I think it very much applies there. I know an argument has been made, for example, that a lot of what Barack Obama did in his campaigns and trying to involve many more people through the internet was to utilize presumption much more in the political process. But yeah, to the degree that you turn, the public into passive observers of the political scene, not actively involved in the political scene, you neuter them, and so I think a more vibrant democracy is a more presumption-oriented democracy. So I think, I agree with you. But of course, governments often try to neuter the public as well. Failed to goad anybody. Thank you.
Getting back to the politics, I wonder if you would consider the Occupy movement, prosumers trying to become a dangerous ogre, and why did that lose steam?
Yeah, I mean, I think it obviously is an example of, presumption. There's no question about it. That's a complicated question as to why it lost steam. I think from the point of view of what I'm interested in, there's not much of a realization that people are these dangerous giants, that people are prosumers, and that they have this agency and it matters what they do. But social movements, tend to do that. They tend to come to the fore, have a moment in the sun, and then to recede. And it seems as if the Occupy movement has done that. I don't think that's a flaw in presumption. I think it's a characteristic of social movements in general, to most social movements anyway.
Sounds like some of what you're talking about goes back to Mill's idea about the cheerful robot. And Mills, I think, has some conclusions about the role of social scientists in this problem of the cheerful robot in contemporary society. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you see the role of social scientists. And I know a lot of the students in the room are actually graduating seniors. And so the role then of undergraduate sociology majors and sort of moving forward with their responsibilities in society.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about C. Wright Mills, and Mills, I think, was thinking about workers, thinking about office workers or factory workers as cheerful robots. I think, many of the examples that I'm using are, from the realm of what we conventionally think of as consumption. And I think one of the really dramatic developments in the last half century has been the application of ideas that were created to turn workers into cheerful robots to now turn consumers into cheerful robots. So, if you're on the drive-through window at McDonald's, you're in a sense on the assembly line, and the same principles that are applied in the automobile assembly line or any kind of assembly line are being applied there. In fact, another sort of famous movement in industrial society was Taylorism and scientific management. And I've written about how Taylorism is alive and well, but it's now called McDonaldism, because basically the workers in McDonald's are having the same sort of principles applied to them. It's really astounding. It's one thing to apply these principles to people you pay. It's another thing to apply these principles to people who pay you. And even though you're paying, these same principles are being applied to you. I always when I lecture on McDonaldization, which is a very bleak image of Max Weber's iron cage theory of the world, that we're moving further and further into this iron cage, and the bars are getting thicker and thicker and more. voluminous, students will sometimes say to me, well, what's the point? What's the point of you talking to us about this? Why it's so depressing, and it's such a negative view of the world. Why should we be listening to you? And my answer is, and I think it's the answer to your question, is I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I hope that when I talk about McDonaldization, I hope I'm angering my students about what this system does. And here I hope I'm angering you about what those in power are doing with presumption and the way in which they're using presumption in ways that you're not always cognizant of. Putting all of these things together in sort of this vast web of presumption is not something that we usually do. And I want to make you angry about it and say, well, I'm not cleaning up in the cafeteria anymore. I'm not working for McDonald's anymore. I'm not working for the bank anymore. Let them pay me. But so I think that gets an answer to your question.
Isn't it in part that we're searching for, I mean, we are looking for more control in doing things for ourselves? I mean, like in the cafeteria, I even get annoyed that I have to tell people what I want in the serving line because they don't know how much I want and they don't know, what, all of these things. And so I think it would be better, it's like, I like doing things for myself. And if you're gonna go, I mean, I like paying for the bank at an ATM, sorry, not an ATM machine, but like that I get. But in terms of cafeteria, in terms of McDonald's, wouldn't it be more expensive? I kind of feel like they will integrate their costs so that they're going to have to hire somebody else to clean up if that's part of their system. So I guess I don't know if I'm being exploited because I'd have to like look at specific finances. But how would you argue that?
Well, I think you made 2 points. One is the point I made before about alienation and contentment. People like to do these things, like there's great freedom in going to the soft drink machine and putting a little bit of Dr. Pepper in your Coca-Cola or something like that. This is a high in terms of freedom and independence, right? And your notions of you'd rather do it yourself in a variety of different ways. So I don't think there's any question that people are, more. Lots of people are more content doing that. I had another point that remind me the last part of what you said.
About that corporations would
yeah.
pay more. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one theory, that because we do this work for nothing, we get to pay less for it. So I remember when the first self-serve gasoline stations came into existence, and the argument was we were paying less because we were pumping our own gas, and they dramatically lowered the price. Over time the price went up. You couldn't really tell whether you were actually, we see these pumps that purport to be lower because we're doing the service ourselves. But the point is that we don't know whether we are getting things less expensively because we're doing the work ourselves, or corporations are making much higher profits because we're doing the work and they're paying us nothing. What we do know is McDonald's is an extraordinarily profitable corporation, unbelievably profitable. And one of the reasons, theoretically, it is so profitable is you work for nothing for them. I don't think that it would be very hard. I'm not sure that McDonald's has the data, and in any case, they certainly would never let you have access to the data. But at least an argument could be made that they're not. At least you could say this: they're not kicking back to you all the savings they should be kicking back to you, but they are increasing their profits. Maybe you're paying a little bit less because you're doing the work. But we do know that their profits are extraordinary, and one of the reasons may be because you're working for nothing.
I'll ask a question.
George, thanks for your talk. I've got a couple of questions relating to digitally mediated prosumption. No surprise given my work. One of the things I've been really intrigued by is being able to deposit checks via an iPhone or other mobile device, which is a kind of, it's sort of extending some of the things that you're talking about ATMs and other things. But I wanted to connect that to issues of unemployment and other things. So you sort of said, oh, well, the decrease of bank tellers.
Right.
One of the other arguments that could be made for this is previously people, if they needed to do their everyday tasks and they had forms of employment which were 9 to 5, so all during bank hours, and they couldn't make it to the bank, they couldn't make it to the store and buy things, they could go online now, deposit their checks at night, or like I did the other day, buy some toothpaste and toothbrushes at 2 a.m. in the morning from drugstore. Clearly I'm prosuming, but I wanted to ask if there's also a potential argument or investigation that could be made in terms of how that could, I don't want to use the word agency, but could offer more flexible abilities of people to engage in jobs that they couldn't otherwise do, that would preclude them from other economic activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think there's any question that there are positive sides to presumption, that there are positive sides from the point of view of the individual. Although I was thinking the other day that I had downloaded my boarding pass on my phone, and as I got to the line to show it to the guy, I somehow pressed something that went right into my trash, and so then I had to run all the way back to get a paper and run all, and I was offended by my ineptitude as a prosumer, I guess, by both being a prosumer and an inept prosumer, and I was paying the costs of my ineptitude. Look, I'm mainly exaggerating here or focusing on, I'm a social critic. Everything I write about, my wife, finds it unbearable to live with me because she says you're critical of everything, and that's my job, and I think that's the job of much of sociology is to look at things. I mean, point is that I'm talking about a lot of things that most of you do, and I don't think you think of them critically or have thought of them critically. I tend to think of these things always from a critical point of view. Marx was a critic of capitalism. Weber was a critic of rationalization. All of sociology, I think really good sociology, is about this kind of social criticism. So I'm not giving you a balanced portrayal here of presumption. I understand that there are positives to presumption. I understand that there are gains to individuals and even to society from the point of view of presumption. But I think we ought to look at some of the hidden forces and factors and costs involved in this, especially from our point of view of prosumers. And I always sort of adopt a critical negative view of corporations. I'm always suspicious about what it is that they're doing. They're not making us presumers because they like us or because they want to empower us. They're making us presumers because they can cut people, reduce their payrolls, and get things from us. And better if we like doing those things for them. So. It is very much a one-sided perspective, but I don't think that perspective has been adopted enough. And I already pointed out that Toffler takes this incredibly romantic view of the prosumer, that the prosumer is really the solution to everything. And the prosumer may be the solution to everything, but not the way it's currently constituted in American power structure and in American capitalism.
Just want to add, well, it's not, I'm following the same thing, but to add to the critical side that you're saying. So one other thing that I wanted to raise, and it's not a question, but more a comment, and it sort of goes back to Facebook and building a $100 billion company. So one thing I think is interesting from what you raised there is not just that we're prosuming, right, and that we are doing work for free, but another thing I think that maybe we need to think very critically about is our creation of this data also has major privacy issues from prosumption, especially digitally. So not only do we give our labor for free, but we end up compromising our privacy for free too.
Right.
So we have a kind of double bind
Right.
in terms of that, which I think is deeply problematic from a sociological point of view.
It's a good point, and something I should have mentioned. But the other part of it is that on the internet, a lot of our presumption is unconscious in the sense that we are making choices and hitting keystrokes and things like that, and data is being produced that is being captured about us and about the choices that we've made, and we're producing that tons of data, which is then being used to, getting ads, popping up on our computers selling us things of one kind or another. So it's not just that we're consciously being prosumers, but on the internet, perhaps more importantly, we are unconsciously being prosumers and forever giving corporations all kinds of data that they can use on the one hand to increase their profitability by directed selling at us because of what we've chosen. On the other hand, as you point out, creating all kinds of surveillance problems because all of this data that we produced is there and can be, mashed up and put together in all kinds of different ways that could be used in highly negative kinds of ways. So yeah, surveillance is a big issue there. Anyone else? Good, because I don't get my full pay if we quit before.
Okay, hopefully not too redundant.
I'm getting paid by the hour, and I'm committed to work for 2 hours. Go ahead.
I guess sort of on a similar vein, I think I'm interested in the way that this idea of like these more convenient checkout systems at the grocery stores or fast food, like arms of the drive-through arms of fast food restaurants, how they've been marketed to consumers in a way that's like pro-convenience and as in filling a need or filling a helping them with their lives, and whether you think that's part of their mass strategy to exploit the consumer, or what you think of the messages of how these originated.
Are you thinking of some specific advertising campaign?
No, I guess not specific, but just the idea. I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, great, that's more convenient that I can go to the express lane and check out my 3 items instead of waiting in line for the human to do it for me."
Yeah.
Or, people think of it sort of as the one behind me was saying, kind of like an empowerment idea,
Right.
and I'm thinking of how did that sort of message get planted in our heads and that conception of it.
Yeah, well, I think it's an easier sell, right, to sell this kind of thing to people by saying that it's empowering them, it's helping them in various kinds of ways. People are not going to object to doing things that they think or advertisements are leading them to believe that they are being advantaged by this. Then McDonald's is not going to advertise, use the drive-through window because we found that we make 10 cents more an hour or 10 cents more an order when people use the drive-through window and take their garbage with them. I mean, that's not an effective advertisement. You're not going to use it for that reason. But if you're told that it's more efficient for you to do that, you don't have to wait, you don't have to get out of your car. Imagine the inconvenience of getting out of your car, walking into the store, ordering your food, sitting down on those uncomfortable chairs and leaving. It's, so it's marketed as being, helping you. It's not, and that's more likely to be much more successful than if it's marketed to help them. You're not going to do it to help McDonald's. You don't want to help McDonald's, I don't think. No, exactly. If you do, you can't speak to me. I'm sorry, I interrupted you for a joke, which the jokes are always much more important to me than yeah, sorry.
Fair enough. I guess I was just wondering whether you think that that's part of the exploitation, or whether it really is, a convenience factor for them. See what I'm
For
saying?
them or you?
For us, sorry, for them being consumers.
Look, there's no question that there are advantages, or people perceive that there are advantages. I mean, I'll inconvenience myself. As I said, I'll wait at the checkout in the supermarket, and I'll wait there until somebody comes. It would be easier for me to check it out myself, but it so angers me that I don't do it. So, I don't think there's any doubt that, people think that they're being advantaged by this, but I think I've actually lost the strand of what I want to say here. What were you asking again?
Whether it was conscious exploitation. I mean, obviously it was. They have intelligent business plans, but I guess I've sort of lost it too. I think just the idea that is it more for the convenience of the consumer and more this empowerment side of it, or more the exploitation side of it?
Well, that's a judgment you can make, right? Do you think it's more about McDonald's is more about making things convenient for you, or do you think McDonald's is more about making money and raising its stock price? I'm not leading you to an answer there.
Oh, no.
You have to make that judgment for yourself as to what you think they're about. I don't think McDonald's is about making life easier for you. I think it's about, making money. And they can make money by exploiting you in various ways as a prosumer. I mean, maybe that's an oversimplification of it. Maybe those people in Oak Brook or Oak Park, Illinois, sit around saying, "How can we make life easier for the prosumer?" I mean, actually, one of the interesting things here, by the way, in terms of what they're thinking is they have no concept of the prosumer. I mean, they're doing. It's not as if they're sitting around, reading Alvin Toffler or reading me, for that matter, saying, "Gee, what are we going to do? How are we going to exploit the prosumer?" They're doing things. They're doing a variety of different things, all of which are oriented toward how do they make more money. And I think, these various things that have gone on here are all about, increasing their profitability. And many of them have to do with transferring us more into prosumers and exploiting our prosumer activities.
So I am thinking about classes. And if
Social
there-
classes?
Yes. And if there is a different level of presumption based on the class, so, for example, I feel like lower classes will go to more fast food restaurants, not to clean up after themselves, or go grocery shopping, whereas if you're in a higher class, you, for example, may have a maid or butler, or go to a really nice restaurant where you aren't eating to clean up after yourself. And I just wondering if there are different levels of presumption, just what you have to say on that.
Yeah, that would be a very interesting study to do, the relationship between social class and prosumption. And I think the obvious hypothesis is the lower the social class, the more you are forced to be prosumers. You're forced to do things for yourself, because the higher end, as you point out, a higher end restaurant where people are doing things for you, you've got to pay more for that. And so the rich generally are able to avoid much of the prosumption, and poor are sort of forced more and more into presumption of one kind or another. But my view about that is that even though there is that social class difference, the whole structure of society is changing in this direction and will move more and more in this direction, and especially online in the digital world. I don't know that there's much of any variation by social class. Everybody's got to do it that way online, so social class differences disappear there. But it would be an interesting paper to write on the relationship between social class and presumption. And when I argue on McDonaldization, obviously McDonald's is low-priced food. Basically, lower and middle class people are more likely to use those kinds of food outlets. But the truth is that it's considered to be for some reason that escapes me, such a desirable place to eat and style of eating that it to some degree defies social class. So I'm sure there's a wealthy student or two at Bowdoin who eats at McDonald's. So I'll take confessions after the talk if you're wealthy and eat at McDonald's.
I guess I think this is maybe a little bit related to a lot of the questions that people have been asking, but at the beginning of the talk, you say that you believe that presumption is normal. We've always been prosumers. So my question is sort of I think people upon hearing the talk are sort of like interested. How do we measure like whether the presumption that we're involved with is balanced or not? Because I think also like when we hear the arguments like against outlaw the self-checkout lanes, that seems to be argument against balance and back toward a sort of bifurcation of consumer and production,
Yeah.
which has its own possible negative issues associated with it. But
You're talking about the balance presumption.
right, and I think that balance was mentioned being like the maybe normal, or like it's like we could be sort of prosumers and be taken advantage of, or
No, I didn't mean it that way. I meant it that sort of the left side of this, I think it's the left, is more toward what we traditionally think of as production. It's still presumption, but it's more what we traditionally think of production. The other side is more what we traditionally think of as consumption. Balanced presumption, maybe I need a better term there, but the idea is that in old-fashioned terms, the production aspect and the consumption aspect are more balanced, so it's not in one extreme or the other. So it's balanced in that sense. You're talking about balanced more ideologically, or?
Well, no, I mean, I sort of meant in this way, if we're considering the activities that we partake in on both on behalf of ourselves and on behalf of corporations, like what might be the ways that we might measure for ourselves whether the like cost benefit analysis, like how much is benefiting us, how much is benefiting the other.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's a different question. It's a different kind of balance, right, in terms of cost. What are the costs to you to do this? What are the benefits? I mean, you're right, a lot of the questions have been on that issue of what are the costs and benefits. Obviously, there's no simple answer to that question, but I think maybe the key to this whole talk is to say that's a question you ought to ask yourselves. What are the costs and benefits for each of these acts of presumption? And are the benefits greater for you or the costs greater for you? And maybe that's a way you as individuals can decide whether you want to engage in these. But I think actually more importantly is just to think in terms of presumption. Again, I don't think, we haven't had the concept, so we don't think of ourselves as prosumers. We don't think in terms of the process of presumption. So just thinking in those terms, thinking of ourselves as prosumers, leads to a variety of other kinds of questions that we need to answer for ourselves in terms of individual cost benefits. But I think we also need to answer at a more societal level in the sense of, is this an equitable system? Is it fair that we give Mark Zuckerberg all this data about ourselves and he's got $100 billion or his corporation and we got nothing? And there are lots of similar kinds of questions that can be raised there, which is another kind of balance kind of question. I mean, maybe we should be paid for each bit of data that we purposely or unconsciously provide to Facebook. Probably not doable, huh, Diraj?
To watch funny videos in return.
Okay, anything else?
Any other questions?
Well, if you were head of the Bureau of Prosumer Affairs, what are the
I'm not in favor of prosumers having affairs. I think it's be very active and messy.
What's the policy agenda that you'd want to pursue in light of the concerns that you raise?
You're asking me a practical question. We talked about this at lunch. If I had the answers to those practical questions, I'd be back in a business school and getting paid thousands and thousands of dollars an hour for consulting fees. But no, I think it's a consciousness of the extent and increasing degree to which people are immersed in this, and asking the kind of questions we just talked about before of do we benefit from this more than it costs us? Does the society benefit more than it costs us? Is it making a more unequal society? Is this, I mean, after all, Marx's point was that the exploitation of the poorly paid worker was creating this extraordinarily stratified society. Well, if we have prosumers who are not being paid at all, are we producing an even more stratified society and with even higher costs? And of course, beyond that, the whole idea of class consciousness and class revolution, difficult to think of when you're thinking of workers. How do you think of it in terms of prosumers? How, let's say you were really angry about this and you were, how would you mobilize? How would you develop such a diverse set of people doing such a diverse, with washing your dogs and going through the drive-thru and taking your garbage with you and going to ATM machines and doing self-checkouts? How do you mobilize all those people to get a sense of what their commonalities are and what their grievances are? And who do you grieve against? And how do you grieve? And I mean, I think lots of interesting questions. But I wouldn't get the job because I'd be asking, I think, more radical questions than the government would like to ask. But thanks for thinking for a new career for me. Okay, thanks a lot.